The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show, and what a bonus show it is. I want to start with, I guess I should first set this up by pointing out that there are these sort of right-wing political memes, I guess we could call them, or talking points, which claim to espouse very particular values by the right. But as soon as those values conflict with what their actual policy preference is, they abandon the value. Now, that explanation may not be super clear, so let me give you an example. States' rights is an example of a value that the right, particularly small government, sort of originalist interpreters of the United States founding fathers' work, claim to espouse. States' rights, there is this a deference that states should get when it comes to figuring out what's best for them. And this is sort of what was at the root, in part, of the Civil War. We colloquially understand the Civil War to have been about slavery, and it was. But there are those who say, well, really, it was about states' rights. And what they mean by that is a state's right to continue having legal slavery, even if the federal government doesn't want that. Okay? So they're all about states' rights. Until all of a sudden states are doing something they don't like. We saw this with gay marriage. We saw this with marijuana in many cases, and we'll actually talk about that in the next story. And we also are seeing it now when it comes to the border crisis, because the federal government, Donald Trump, claims that there's a crisis on the U.S.-Mexico border. But the U.S.-Mexico border involves a number of states, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. I hope I have the picture of the U.S. map correct in my head. And there may be states that don't necessarily agree with the federal government's assessment of that crisis. And in fact, that's what we're seeing, because New Mexico Governor Michelle Grisham has ordered that the state's National Guard withdraw almost all of its troops that have been stationed along the U.S.-Mexico border. This happened Tuesday night, just a couple days ago, rejecting the framing of the federal government, meaning Donald Trump, that there is, in fact, an emergency and a crisis there. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise to us when it comes to a governor disagreeing with the characterization, because governors are sort of an interesting position politically, in that they are, of course, political figures, and they are elected via political campaigns, and much of what they do is very political. But governorships are different than being a senator or a member of the House of Representatives in a lot of ways, but in one way, in that it's a much more administrative job. You're dealing, of course, our elected officials in Washington deal with budgets and spending and all of that type of stuff. But there's a much more sort of like nitty-gritty je ne sais quoi about governorships that get them to have to look very closely at situations exactly like this. Like, does it make sense to have our state's National Guard, because National Guards are, states have their own National Guards that are administered, although they can be directed by the federal government. Does it make sense to have them in any particular deployment? And here, Grisham says that, no, it doesn't make any sense, and she is pulling them back. And then right away, you see the right-wingers who typically are of the states' rights sort of mindset, instead saying, well, there is that federal supremacy clause, which says that on certain issues, including those of national security, the federal government's desires are what reigns supreme. And that's exactly where the disagreement is. I mean, the state doesn't agree that this actually is an issue of national security importance to the degree or at all in the way that the federal government is saying. Who's ultimately going to win? I think that the state is probably going to win out on this one. But to be perfectly frank, I mean, there's so many other battles that Donald Trump is engaged in that I don't see this even really blowing up too much more. Although I could be wrong, and maybe he will make a really big deal out of it. But states' rights, one of the most important values to the right, except when a state wants to do something that they don't like. Let's now talk about the marijuana issue related to states' rights. Idaho State Police say that they seized over 6,700 pounds of marijuana from a truck that was passing through the state last month. The Colorado company bought the plants in Oregon, and they say it's all legal. The truck driver now is facing marijuana trafficking charges. And very quickly, we're getting into another one of these stories of this kind of patchwork of laws that exist on the topic of marijuana between and among states and in the context of the federal government. The plants were being transported by a Colorado company where, of course, there is legal recreational marijuana. It was passing through Oregon. And now the question is, which laws apply here? And also, is the designation of the drugs as hemp versus cannabis going to be legally relevant? I actually have a friend who let's see, I'm trying to figure out what I should say. I have a friend who's in a state that has legal recreational marijuana, who is getting involved in the hemp business and got involved in some sales across state lines. And one of my friend's customers ended up getting arrested because they were in a state where marijuana is not legal. But of course, the idea is that hemp, because it has no or almost no CBD, I'm going from memory here, is considered a different product, and it's basic or a THC. I'm getting the story all wrong. Because it has little or is supposed to have little or no THC, it's not considered psychoactive, and thus it can be sold. It's legal. Except that this customer of my friend's got stopped in a state with no legal marijuana. Field officers identified what looked like marijuana, field tested it, and it came back positive for THC because apparently my friend was not exactly accurate when it came to the THC content. And of course, this all matters. Why? It doesn't matter that this is all completely legal in Massachusetts. It doesn't matter that my friend is I just gave away the state. Running a completely legal business in Massachusetts. But once you cross those state lines, federal law applies, and then the destination state's law applies. So this is going to be an interesting case where once again, we are starting to see disagreements about exactly where should the law begin and end for a California company, a Colorado company, transporting something into their state, but in a state with different rules in the broader context where marijuana is illegal federally, but they are claiming that it is hemp. But there is a field test that is saying, well, it's not really hemp by the federal definition of the law. What I come to is this is a mess. This is not a good use of law enforcement resources. And this is simply not something that we should be involved in at all. We should legalize, we should regulate, and we should use that revenue that the federal and state governments could potentially take in, and some state governments are taking in, to deal with drug addiction as a public health phenomenon rather than as a criminal phenomenon, and then take the extra money and use it to improve infrastructure and education and so many other things. But I don't think anybody in the audience is surprised that that's my opinion. We'll see what ultimately happens with that case. Some good news from the city of Sandusky, Ohio. I've been talking for years now about how in Argentina, where I was born, Election Day is, I believe it's on a Sunday, and there are certain rules on that day about alcohol sales and some other rules. But the point is, you want to make it so that as many people as possible vote. Now, Argentina also has mandatory voting where you have to justify not voting. And there are only a certain number of explanations that are considered valid by the state in terms of why you didn't vote. But putting that aside, the idea of moving voting to the weekends and or making voting day, making election day a holiday have been floated in the United States for a long time. And it would be a very good way of getting voter turnout up. At the same time, we've seen that there is more and more sort of scrutiny around Columbus Day, given the horrible actions of those first settlers from Europe in what is now the United States. And there have been more and more movements to say, let's either rename Columbus Day as something else, or let's cancel it as a holiday altogether. In Sandusky, Ohio, Columbus Day is no longer going to be recognized as an official holiday. And instead, in order to not just lose a day off for city workers, they are going to have Election Day as a holiday. Now, it's not making it a holiday for all workers. It's not that all of a sudden, if you work at a bank in Sandusky, Ohio, you now get the day off because it's Election Day. But at least as far as city government is concerned, they are switching out Columbus Day with Election Day as a holiday. And I think that this is great. Now, the city is giving two reasons for why they're doing this. One is they say that they want to prioritize voting, which is great. And number two, they are recognizing the controversial origins of Columbus Day, which I also think is fine. And as many people who have been with the show for a while know, I just think it's important to have time off for staff. So we take most federal holidays, Columbus Day being one of those. And every time we do it, angry emails come in saying, David, how dare you? This is you are celebrating genocide and all of this other stuff. Take some other day off. And of course, the problem with that is that when we take a day off and it's just a random day off, people are mad that we're off, but Sam Cedar is working and the Young Turks are working and Kyle Kulinski is working. So it's kind of a lose-lose. So I just take the approach of, for the most part, we take off federal holidays, but it has not been without controversy. So I personally would love to see Election Day become a holiday. I don't really care if Columbus Day isn't a holiday, but the problem for our staff is going to be we're a political show. So even if Election Day becomes a holiday, we can't take Election Day off. It's a political show. We've got to report on what's going on with the election. So I think if at some point in the future of the United States, Columbus Day is no longer a federal holiday, but Election Day is, then we will have to pick some other day, maybe a Monday a few weeks after Election Day or something like that, to make a David Pakman Show holiday. Maybe there's some other day I should be thinking of that should be the replacement holiday if Election Day someday becomes a holiday. But federally, this isn't going to happen anytime soon because Republicans don't want people to vote. Republicans benefit from lower voter turnout and fewer people voting, and they would fight tooth and nail because they don't want to make it easier for people to vote. But Sandusky, Ohio, good for them. We have seen some state-level moves towards ranked choice voting. We're seeing a city-level decision to make Election Day a holiday for their employees. Little silver linings that I guess are nice to be able to point to when we can.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.